Secret societies, whispers in the halls of power, the Vatican. Talk about a recipe for intrigue. We've got our work cut out for us today with these excerpts on La Santa Alianza.
La Santa Alianza, yeah. The Vatican's rumored Secret Service arm, I mean, even the name has a certain...
A Dan Brown novel vibe.
Exactly. So how do we even start to untangle something that's practically defined by secrecy?
Well, I guess the best place to start is always with what we do know, right?
Yeah. And our excerpts offer these tantalizing glimpses, these fragments that suggest La Santa Alianza could go as far back as the 16th century.
Wow, so we're talking about the time of the Reformation?
Exactly. A time of immense upheaval for the Catholic Church, right?
Right.
The Protestant Reformation, it was a challenge on a fundamental level.
Okay, so we've got cardinals and scholars publicly debating scripture and theology, but then behind the scenes, there's potentially this
shadowy counterpart, working in the shadows to protect the church's interests, yeah.
It's like history's greatest game of chess, but with higher stakes.
Absolutely. Information was power, maybe even more than it is now. Knowing the inner workings of a rival court, anticipating a political shift, I mean, that could be the difference between survival and, well, you get the idea.
So they needed eyes and ears everywhere, but we're talking about an era long before the internet, before even, reliable postal services.
Right. So what do? They get creative. Mm-hmm. These excerpts hint at this network of informants, right? People strategically placed within royal courts, religious orders, even merchant guilds.
So less James Bond, more.
More like everyday people in extraordinary positions. They could observe, they could report, they might even be able to subtly influence events.
It's almost more intriguing than this image of, a trained secret agent with all the gadgets.
Right, this subtle web of information spanning across Europe.
All leading back to the Vatican.
Exactly. And as history marches on, as we move through the centuries, this organization, it's supposedly evolved. Each era, it brought new challenges for the church. And you have to imagine La Santa Alianza, they would have had to adapt to those challenges.
So how much did they actually change with the times? We're talking about an organization that might have existed for, 400 years? From the whispers and rumors of the 16th century to the political realities of the 19th century, for example.
It's a question that still fascinates historians today. Did they become more sophisticated, more deeply embedded in global affairs? To even try and answer those questions, I mean, we really have to dig into what they were supposedly doing all those years.
Let's dig in. What kind of activities are we talking about? What was La Santa Alianza actually doing in the shadows? All right, so we're talking about a secretive organization potentially operating across centuries. I mean, where do you even begin to narrow that down?
Well, luckily we do have these excerpts, right? And they mention a few specific historical events, places where La Santa Alianza might, left their fingerprints.
Okay, so we're talking about actual events, actual moments in history that might give us some clues about how they operated, their motives.
Exactly. And one that really jumps out, at least for me, is Operation Pedro Pan.
Operation Pedro Pan. That name rings a bell, but I can't quite place it.
It's a pretty incredible story, really. Between 1960 and 1962, over 14,000 Cuban children were evacuated from Cuba to the United States. It was right in the thick of the Cold War, right after the Cuban Revolution. A lot of families were afraid of what Castro's regime might mean, especially for their kids.
So they sent their children away.
Yeah, thousands of them. Many of them, they ended up living with foster families in the U.S. while their parents, they were trying to find a way to get out of Cuba.
Wow, talk about a heart-wrenching situation. 14,000 children separated from their families. And the excerpts, they suggest that the Vatican had a hand in this.
It's not entirely clear how large a role they played, but the excerpts do hint that, the church, and maybe the La Santa Alianza specifically, were involved in those evacuations.
What kind of involvement are we talking? I mean, it's not like they were bundling kids onto planes in the dead of night, right?
Well, we don't know exactly how it all went down, but think about the logistics. You've got to get visas and travel documents for thousands of children. You've got to secure passage on flights, find places for them to stay when they arrive in a foreign country. This wasn't a simple task, especially in the middle of, all the political tension of the Cold War.
Right. So this wasn't about spies and secret messages. It was about what? Logistics, moving people.
Exactly. If La Santa Alianza was involved, it would suggest they had a kind of global reach, a capacity to operate on a scale that went way beyond just gathering information.
They were shaping events on the ground?
Potentially, yeah.
But the question is why? I mean, was this just like a humanitarian effort on the church's part? Or were there larger geopolitical goals at play here? Was this, I don't know, maybe La Santa Alianza acting as the Vatican's like invisible hand in the fight against communism?
It's definitely a question worth considering, especially as we look at other events from this era.
Yeah.
I mean, the excerpts, they also mention the Vatican during World War II, during the Holocaust.
And that's where things get, I don't know, a lot more complicated. It's hard to reconcile that period in history with this idea of a benevolent organization dedicated to protecting the church, you know?
Right. It's a period that really demands a nuanced perspective. We have documented cases of individuals within the church, priests, nuns, even just everyday people. They risked their lives to shelter Jews from the Nazis. But at the same time, there's the undeniable fact of Pope Pius XII, his policy of neutrality throughout the war.
A silence that honestly still sparks debate today. Some argue he was just trying to protect the church, protect its interests, but
it came at a cost. And the role of La Santa Alianza during this period, if there even was one, it's still a big unknown. Did they use their networks, assuming those networks existed, to help those in need? Or did they get caught up, maybe even unintentionally, in the moral compromises of the war?
It's a question that honestly applies to a lot of powerful institutions during wartime, doesn't it? Where do you draw the line between protecting your own and holding on to your values when the world around you is, falling apart?
A line that La Santa Alianza may have grappled with for, centuries, potentially. And it's a line that comes into sharp focus when we look at a scandal that really rocked the Vatican to its core. The Banco Ambrosiano affair.
Okay, now that sounds like something straight out of a movie, Banco Ambrosiano. It's less church history and more like financial thriller, you know? So what's the story here? How does the Vatican get mixed up in a banking scandal?
Okay, so at the center of this whole thing, you've got Banco Ambrosiano. It was a private Italian bank. And they had these, close ties to the Vatican Bank.
Close ties, huh?
Yeah, and the guy running Banco Ambrosiano, Roberto Calvi, he was known for, let's just say, playing both sides of the field. Powerful financial figures, yeah, but also some shadier characters.
Shady how? Organized crime, kind of shady.
There were definitely whispers. But it gets murkier, right? Because the Vatican Bank itself, they were deeply invested in Banco Ambrosiano.
I think I'm starting to see where this is going. It doesn't sound good.
It wasn't. 1982, the whole thing implodes. Banco Ambrosiano goes belly up. And when the investigators start digging through the wreckage, what do they find? Fraudulent loans, shell companies, money laundering on a massive scale. It was a mess.
Okay, so we've got financial crimes, high-level corruption, but the big question is, the Vatican, how much did they know about all of this?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And their stance has always been, we were victims just like everyone else. We had no idea what Calvi was really up to.
But come on, if La Santa Alianza was this all-seeing, all-knowing organization, wouldn't they have caught wind of something this big?
It's a good question. Did they just completely miss it? Or was there a deliberate effort to look the other way? Maybe to protect the church's reputation, its finances, who knows? And then there's the death of Calvi himself.
Oh, yeah, I'd almost forgotten about that part. Found hanged under a bridge in London.
Blackfriars Bridge, yeah.
Yeah.
Officially ruled a suicide, but the circumstances were so strange,
It's like something out of a spy novel.
Right. And it fueled all these conspiracy theories. Did someone silence him? Was he about to talk? We'll probably never know for sure.
So what's the takeaway here? We've got the Vatican caught up in this web of financial crime, possible mafia ties, a suspicious death. And their secret organization, it's there somewhere, lurking in the background. It's almost too much.
And maybe that's the point. Maybe that's the legacy of La Santa Alianza, this enduring mystery, this unanswered question. Did they protect the church, or did they, in some ways, embody the very things they were supposed to be fighting against?
That's a pretty heavy thought. I mean, we came into this deep dive hoping to unravel a mystery, and if anything, I feel like we've just, added more layers to it.
History's funny like that. But I think even with all the unknowns, even with all the speculation, there's still something we can take away from all of this.
What's
the very idea of La Santa Alianza, whether you believe they were a force for good, for bad, or somewhere in between, it highlights something fundamental about power, doesn't it? The lengths people and institutions will go to protect their interests, to shape the world around them. It's a story that's as old as time.
That's true. It reminds us that there are always layers to these stories. Behind the official accounts, behind the history books, there are always these shadows where other forces are at work.
And as for La Santa Alianza, their story might remain shrouded in mystery. But the questions they raise, those are definitely worth thinking about.
They are. So to everyone listening, As we wrap up this deep dive, we'll leave you with this. Keep asking those questions. What other secrets are still waiting to be uncovered? And what will we do when we find them? Until next time.